Good evening. Protesting students have started a hunger strike in Admiralty after admitting failure in last night's bid to escalate their campaign for greater democracy. Joshua Wong, who heads the activist group Scholarism, launched the hunger strike a short while ago with two others, hoping to force the government back to the negotiating table. That's after 40 protesters were arrested during violent clashes with police last night and this morning. Earlier today, the chief executive warned them that the public has had enough, and protesters should not mistake tolerance for weakness on the part of police. ATV's Emily Siu reports.
Scores of police officers charged down Long Wall Road outside the government's Tamar headquarters at around 7 this morning to disperse pro-democracy protesters who had occupied it during a night of chaos. Police hosed demonstrators with cold water for the first time. When water didn't work, they went back to their batons and pepper spray. Police continued to force protesters off the road and push them towards Tamar Park, leading to more chaotic scenes. Many were subdued and arrested. The crowd eventually reached the Tamar footbridge above Harcourt Road and Connaught Road Central, the main protest base. The area became crammed with protesters refusing to budge. This led to another round of clashes. Frontline reporters were not spared by police. Protesters eventually retreated to Harcourt Road. There was another flare-up when some angry demonstrators allegedly hurled objects towards officers stationed inside Admiralty Centre. Among those injured was a man believed to be an undercover officer who was knocked out cold. He and two others believed to be officers as well were apparently chased and attacked by protesters before they were rescued by reinforcements. While the government called them violent radicals, the protesters insisted they were only responding to police officers going out of control with their batons. Federation of Students leader Alex Chow, who made the call for demonstrators to besiege the government compound last night, turned up in a bid to calm down emotional demonstrators. He later spoke on the main stage in the so-called Umbrella Square, dismissing claims that he was not at the front line when the rally turned violent. Chow apologized to those who were injured, admitting that his strategy to take over Long Wall Road in the bid to surround the government compound had not worked.
We could, of course, say that we have done it for a short time of period, but ultimately, the occupiers, they are eliminated by the police to other spots. So we would say, the plan, it requires and it has lots of room to improve, and it is, in a sense, it fails at last.
But the student leader claims some success in paralyzing government operations by stopping civil servants from going to work this morning. The central government offices were forced to close all morning and could only reopen after lunch. Civil servants had difficulty returning to work because of the new blockades. LegCo meetings scheduled for today also had to be delayed. This afternoon, Chief Executive Leung Chun-ying condemned student leaders for the chaos, repeatedly warning them that public tolerance for the roadblocks and violence had reached its limit. He urged protesters to go home, stressing that his government did not want to be forced into clearing the area. Leung said he did not want to see students being arrested and getting criminal records that would harm their future academic and career prospects. But at the same time, he warned them not to mistake tolerance for weakness, stressing that police were more than capable of shutting them down. The government is refusing to say if and when it will clear the protest base on Harcourt Road and Connaught Road Central, but many demonstrators are worried it's coming soon and losing their resolve to carry on fighting. While they're complaining of a lack of a clear strategy by those heading the movement, student leaders have vowed to stay the course and urge them not to lose heart.
The High Court has granted an interim injunction to clear barricades from part of the main protest area in Admiralty. But it looks like the court orders will not be carried out right away, as more legal procedures are pending. ATV's An Zheng reports.
Representatives of two subsidiaries of transport operator Kwun Chung Bus arrived at the High Court this afternoon to learn whether their injunction bid had been successful. The two companies, one runs school buses and the other operates cross-border shuttles, wanted the court to give them permission to clear parts of the pro-democracy sit-in area on Connaught Road Central, Harcourt Road, and Cotton Tree Drive in front of government headquarters. In a written judgment, Judge Thomas Au denied the school bus operator's request for an injunction as it could only prove it lost about $4,000 because of the protests. But he granted an interim injunction to the cross-border shuttle firm as it was able to prove that its business plunged by as much as 17% between September and October. Au said the protesters had caused a public nuisance and the right to demonstrate must be balanced with people's right to use the roads. The judge, who had earlier granted the injunctions to clear the Mongkok protest site, added that bailiffs could ask for police help if necessary. The protest zone in Admiralty spans Harcourt Road and Connaught Road Central, from the PLA barracks to the police headquarters in Wan Chai. Today's injunction covers the eastbound lanes of Connaught Road Central, Harcourt Road, and parts of Cotton Tree Drive, but it doesn't cover the whole of Harcourt Road, where protesters have been camping out. It's still subject to change because the judge has asked the plaintiff to submit more information to clarify the exact areas it would like cleared. Kwun Chung Chairman Matthew Wong said all supplementary information will have to be submitted by Thursday. Occupy protesters have vowed to file an appeal against the injunction. An Chang, ATV News.
Last night's clashes were some of the worst we've seen since the Occupy protests began at the end of September. Police used plenty of force against die-hard protesters. ATV's Arthur Keola reports.
The first major confrontation erupted at around 9:30 last night as protesters swarmed onto Longhua Road in a bid to surround government headquarters at Tamar. Riot police swung batons with full force at protesters, some of whom pelted them with all kinds of objects, and glass could be heard breaking during the chaos. Police used one of the regular tactics, hosing demonstrators with a pepper spray solution. Protesters were seen being dragged to the ground and having their hands bound. Some of them wheeled out carts with bricks, but these were seized by police. Labour Party lawmaker Lee Chuk-yan was seen in the thick of action, trying to convince police and protesters to stay calm. But officers continued to lay into the demonstrators with batons, pushing them to the ground and beating them. There was more violence as they tried to stop demonstrators from taking away metal barricades. Some of them scolded officers.
Your duty is protect citizens and not doing this.
Dozens were injured in the clashes, and some were seen being treated for injuries by first aid teams at the site. Many complained that officers were using excessive force, as even with helmets on, protesters were bleeding from head injuries. And the more force police used, the angrier they became. The security minister laid the blame squarely on the protesters.
I just quote one or two scenes. They gathered together, put up their so-called defensive materials, and then they say 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then they charge the police squadron. This is systematic, with a command. Another example, they took news barriers and then form a barricade and use that to push their line forward.
officers were initially able to keep people away from the entrance of the Lunghwa Road tunnel. But the demonstrators eventually forced their way onto the road, blocking traffic on the key artery from Kowloon to Hong Kong Island, running past the chief executive's office. As the crowd spilled out onto both traffic lanes, police chased them into the underpass. Protesters at the front lines fastened together metal barriers and began a new standoff with officers. The demonstrators tried to push their way through using the barriers, as well as homemade shields of wooden boards and cardboard boxes. It didn't last long as police beat them back and eventually removed the new barriers to clear the road again. But at around 3 a.m., demonstrators rushed onto the road again and started barricading it. But this time, officers didn't try to stop them right away. That occupation lasted until 7 a.m. Arthur Urquiola, ATV News.
Police and government officials have blamed protesters for the violence, accusing them of carrying weapons to attack officers. And pro-government lawmakers are demanding immediate action to stop the protests. After the violence last night and this morning, Security Chief Lai Tung-kwok complained that the civil disobedience movement had long abandoned its promise to stay peaceful.
I think what happened last night fully demonstrates that it has far, far away gone beyond what they have declared. The police, after repeated warnings, have to take resolute actions. They have no choice, because it is their duty to restore law and order.
Health Minister Ko Eng-man also condemned the violence and expressed regret that dozens had been injured. Pro-establishment lawmakers came out in another show of solidarity to condemn the protesters and their leaders. The Beijing loyalists urged the government to shut down the protests.
I think the government also should take immediate action. The longer it drags on, actually, the more harm it may cause both to the Hong Kong general public as well as to those young demonstrators.
Police put the blame entirely on the protesters for the violence.
It is obvious that these troublemakers have committed the violent act in a premeditated and organized manner. You can all see from television broadcasts that the violent acts of these rioters have deviated from their proclaimed non-violence, no charging the police, and no vandalism principles.
They showed weapons found in a Tai Kok Chow flat yesterday to support their claims.
Police seized 3 modified air guns and a large number of makeshift wooden shields. There are reasons to believe that this equipment will be used in the illegally occupied areas. In the operation, police arrested 4 males and 1 female for the offenses of possession of firearms without license and possession of instruments fit for unlawful purpose.
Ho said some of the makeshift shields used by demonstrators had nails and screws sticking out, which wounded officers in the chaos. He called for evidence when asked about news footage showing police officers swearing at protesters, taunting them and clapping when they were beaten. Financial Secretary John Tsang is calling protesters ruffians who will cause long-term damage to the local economy. His warning came as local share prices plunged. Here's An Zhang.
There was a grim warning from John Tsang today as Occupy protesters continued to block roads. The financial secretary said small and medium-sized enterprises, hotels, and the catering and transport sectors have suffered losses since the protests began in late September.
My biggest concern is really for the middle and longer term. If the occupation were to continue, no doubt our international image could be seriously damaged, which could lead to the investment confidence running down. And if the instability were to continue, that would also affect pay level as well as new job creations.
Zhang said the government will monitor the impact of the demonstrations and take measures where necessary to help affected people and firms.
I feel that this sort of organized movement is totally irresponsible and is totally sort of ruffian type of attack needs to be reprimanded.
Turning to economic growth, Zhang noted that the city's gross domestic product rose 2.7% in the third quarter, but with uncertainty over the political crisis, full-year GDP could be lower than the revised forecast of 2.2%. The finance minister noted that although there was a rise in the number of tourists last month, the number of non-mainland visitors had fallen. Zhang went on to warn that the rule of law is one of Hong Kong's core values and will be very difficult to heal if it's damaged. The ongoing protests and Zhang's warning that GDP could fall below 2.2% sent local stocks reeling. The Hang Seng Index suffered its biggest single-day loss since February, plunging 620 points, or 2.6%, to close at 23,367. But there was some good news on the retail front. Retail sales in October, when the protests were in full swing, had been expected to dive. Instead, they rose 1.4% from a year ago as $38.3 billion flowed into tills across the city. Ann Chang, ATV News.
Let's take a look at markets overseas, starting in the US. The Dow Jones is down 55 points. In Europe, the London FTSE is down 64 points. The Frankfurt DAX is down 31 points. The Paris CAC is down 15 points. US dollar cross rates, the euro 1.24, the pound is 1.57. It's 118.24 Japanese yen against the US dollar. Now for a look at some international headlines, starting with the latest on a racially charged shooting controversy in the US. ATV's Joyce Wu reports.
Darren Wilson is the man in the center of the latest racial controversy sweeping the US. Last week, a grand jury decided not to charge him for shooting and killing unarmed black teenager Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri in August. The decision triggered fresh riots in Ferguson and protests in about 100 cities across the country. Wilson yesterday resigned from the force, saying he feared for his safety.
Officer Wilson is no longer an employee with the city of Ferguson. There is no severance agreement with Officer Wilson and the city of Ferguson.
The mayor has set up a task force to improve racial relations in a city where a predominantly white police force has been accused of riding roughshod over the black majority. Two sisters in India have refused to be sexually harassed by men in a moving bus in the northern state of Haryana. They confronted the men and one sister used a belt to beat them. Others in the bus just sat and watched. Police later arrested 3 men. 2 boys playing on a popular beach in Sydney have found a baby's body buried in the sand.
We just like to come down here for a swim and a bit of peace and quiet, and for something like this to happen here, it's terrible.
Police are trying to trace the mother. Last week, Sydney police rescued a newborn baby heard crying in a drain where he had been abandoned for 5 days. The infant's mother has been charged with attempted murder. Joyce Wu, ATV News.
The weather forecast for the next few days. Cold and cloudy with a few light rain patches tomorrow. Temperatures will range from 14 to 17 degrees. More of the same on Wednesday, and the mercury will dip further on Thursday. Here's a look at the weather around the world. That's all the news for now. Thanks for watching ATV. I'm Ednitze. Good night.
Coming up, Celebrity MasterChef.